Hello everybody, Jake your resident content cowboy here. Yeehaw, and it's Monday. On Mondays, we do tier lists, and on Wednesdays, we wear pink.
Made out of rainbows and smiles, and we'd all eat it, be happy.
She doesn't even go here.
Do you even go to this school?
No, I just have a lot of feelings.
Okay, go home.
Today's tier list is going to be a little different. This is going to be a tier list based on how good I think this Pokemon will be if you're a new or returning player to Pokemon Unite. I often get asked, should I buy this or this? I only have 8,000 coins. Which supporter should I get? Etc. So I wanted to make a list for players who are possibly not as versed in the game as some, and I can give you an idea of what the game says their skill level is. That's why I've got my game up here as I'm going to be moving that around, and I can tell you what I actually think they're going to be like when you bring them into a game, because some of their difficulty settings and stuff like that are quite a bit off, I would say. Let's take a look at our tiers this week. We've got our God tier. We've only got one freaking God tier Pokemon around here. We're not freaking Norse. We've got our S tier, the So Perf for new players tier. We've got our A tier, a really great choice tier. So basically our A and S tiers are the most solid choices for new returning players, or maybe someone who wants to try out a role that they haven't actually played before. We've got our B tier. Look, I don't know what to tell you, okay? We still have the B tier. So there's that. We've got our C tier, the Corey, these aren't ideal tier, and our D tier, our Decidueye Memorial tier. That is our lowest tier. These are going to be Pokemon that I think could be amazing, by the way. They're going to be amazing Pokemon in the Decidueye Memorial tier, but I think they're going to be not ideal at all for newer players. Let's hop into this thing. We're just going to start right at the beginning of our Pokedex right here with Venusaur, a ranged special attacker in Pokemon Unite. And Pokemon Unite has Venusaur listed as an intermediate Pokemon. I happen to disagree with that. I actually think it's a very, very beginner-friendly Pokemon. They also give this to you for free. This is either S or A. It might even be S tier. I think this is one of the better Pokemon for newer players inside the game. I would highly recommend newer players spend some time with Venusaur, specifically the Giga Dance build, Giga Drain, Pedal Dance. So you just get incredible value out of this build. You fight it ranged, which is really good if you're newer to the game. Sometimes being in melee range can be very, very stressful. And its Unite move is really great. Its survivability is great. This is either S or A. I might even keep it S tier. I think it's really good, and I think it's, you know, it says difficulty intermediate. I think it's more novice. Maybe the Beam build is a little more difficult, but I would disagree. Charizard, listed as a novice Pokemon. For a few reasons, Charizard, it's called a melee all-rounder, but it's essentially a kind of a small amount of range. Char is a really weird Pokemon. It's also not doing particularly well inside this meta. In general, I would say Charizard is closer to the B tier for me. I don't really think this is a great Pokemon for novice players. The thing that actually keeps it out of the C tier, in my opinion, is how useful its Unite move is. It's an incredible Unite move. Outside of that, I actually don't think Char is super beginner friendly right now. It doesn't feel like the best Pokemon to me. Oh, also, please let me know what you think in the comments, if you want to go Pokemon by Pokemon, or if there are a few that you agree with, a few you disagree with. Be cool to each other, but I would love to hear from you. Blastoise, difficulty intermediate. I actually think Blastoise is closer to D tier than it is S tier for sure. Not in terms of being good, but in terms of being difficult to play. Blastoise is a 3-stage evolution, just like Venusaur and Charizard, and that often means as a newer player, you are stuck experience walled. You will see lots of Ivysaurs, Charmeleons, and Wartortles at later moments inside the game, because it can sometimes be hard with these roles, especially a defender role, to get all of the experience you need. Also, I think Blastoise, the Rapid Spin Water Spout build for Blastoise is probably the most popular, and it's also a dangerous build to play, so you're kind of really up in the enemy's face, and you've got to kind of figure out how to make that work. I love Blastoise, but I actually would not recommend it for newer players. I think it's one of the tougher defenders. However, once you get the hang of it, it's very, very good. Pikachu! Pikachu is listed as a novice Pokemon, and I happen to fully agree. While I think Pikachu has some issues inside the game, there are times where you're just so squishy and you're team reliant. I think Pikachu is actually an amazing Pokemon for teaching you how to play Pokemon Unite, especially a ranged mage attacker like Pikachu. It's more of a support Pokemon, it feels like, than an attacker. It's kind of like a support attacker, stunning enemies, picking them up with Volt Tackle or even Thunderbolt. Its Unite move is on a really low cooldown, so you kind of get the hang of using your Unite at a lot of important fights. I actually think Pikachu is one of the best options for new players. You learn a lot and you get to play at extreme range with it. Pikachu's really solid. Clefable. Clefable, everyone's favorite supporter. Clefable is honestly, it's either S or A. It's extremely good and extremely easy to use. Moonlight, I mean, if you're not playing Moonlight, you're gonna have some trouble. But if you are playing the Moonlight build, I actually think Clefable is doing fantastic in the game right now and really easy to pick up. The game says it's novice, and I totally agree. Pikachu and Clefable are really good for newer players. Even though there are a lot of depth to every Pokemon on the roster and you can learn a lot about it, I think Clefable's great for people who are not familiar with the supporter role or who are not super familiar with the game yet. Alolan Ninetales, listed as intermediate, and if that kind of means you're hovering around the B tier, I guess I would likely agree with that. You're really good early, not so good late. You do some things really well, but in general, Alolan Ninetales is not the most stellar Pokemon inside the game. Both builds have some exciting stuff behind them, but they're a little tricky. I think the thing that kind of moves this away from being C tier, like a more difficult Pokemon to deal with, is that you evolve at 4 and you do so well after that. This is close to A. If it was better, honestly, I would kind of move it up to the A tier. Wigglytuff, listed as intermediate. I actually think Wigglytuff is one of the easier tanks to get good with inside of Pokemon Unite. It's a supporter class, a melee supporter, special attack based melee supporter, but in general, you can kind of look at it as a tank like Pokemon. So there are supporters that are more healing focused, there are supporters that are more tank focused. This one is definitely more of a healer. Did I say healer? I'm so dumb. Tank. This one's more of a tank. So Wigglytuff is really good at just getting in the enemy's face with Sing, putting them to sleep, using your Unite move to help allies. I think it's an easy Pokemon to learn, pretty tough to master, but really not that bad for new players. I think Wigglytuff is ironically a little bit slept on inside the game. Machampion. Difficulty intermediate, melee, all-rounder. Melee Pokemon in general are going to have a harder time than ranged Pokemon, I think, for newer players. But Machamp, I think, is actually pretty solid for a lot of players. Intermediate is a reasonable place to put it if intermediate kind of means the B tier right here. And I think that's about right. It used to probably be a little bit harder, but now its early game is actually really good. So I'm not super stressed about a newer player picking up Machamp. And once they get a hang of its Unite move, they'll be really, really deadly with it. But yeah, Machamp I think is in a very solid place right now. I think it's in a really solid place balance wise, and I think newer players could do all right with it. Slowbro, listed as intermediate. I happen to disagree. I think Slowbro is great for new players. I'm putting it S tier for sure. It's just so tanky. It evolves at 4. It's really hard to punish. You get to play around a lot of fights. While it might be difficult to master, like a lot of these Pokemon are difficult to master, I don't think it's difficult to pick up. I highly recommend this. And the game gives it to you for free, which is awesome. I highly recommend this for new players. If you're not used to a tank, pick up one of the best in the game right now. And it's really not tough to do well with it, which is great. Dodrio, recent added Pokemon. Dodrio, a speedster, listed as expert, and they are not lying. I would stay far, far away from Dodrio if you're a newer player. I love Dodrio. It's probably what you would say is my main right now, even though I don't really fall on one Pokemon. I kind of play everything in the roster. Dodrio is just freaking insane, and also very unique, very difficult to master this Pokemon. In fact, very difficult to pick up. It's just a completely different play style from almost everything on the roster. So I agree with the game here where it says it is expert, our melee speedster. It is a really tough one. And we move right into another extremely tough Pokemon. I also put this in the Decidueye Memorial tier. Gengar is not for newer players, I wouldn't say. It's a melee special attack speedster that kind of fights at range and then kind of fights close. It doesn't have good escape. It's one of the most difficult Pokemon to play effectively in the game. So I would say Gengar is definitely hard, really hard to play as a new player. Blissey. Blissey is S tier for me. Great for new players, amazing healer, amazing shields. You will always be happy to have a Blissey on your team. One of the best Pokemon a new player could pick up is Blissey. I just think it's phenomenal. It does have to fight at melee range, but at the same time, its secure is really, really good. Also, I just think it's great. Mime is listed at intermediate, and I kind of agree with that. I think it's kind of tilting towards the harder side of Pokemon to play. Where are you, Mr. Mime? I'm blind. Here we go. I'm gonna put that down into our C tier. I think Mime is amazing once you learn it, but it actually does feel a little tricky up top with the barriers or figuring out how to effectively power swap. The nice thing about Mime is evolves at 4. Any Pokemon that evolve at 4 also just kind of bump up the list a little bit, but I think effectively using Confusion and Barrier, or even Psychic Power Swap, Barrier Power Swap, or Confusion Power Swap, I think all of them are a little tricky. It's not the most complex Pokemon in the game, but Mime is definitely one of the tougher ones. Scizor. Scissor's really cool because it's 2 Pokemon in 1. It's Scizor and it's Scyther. Scyther, I think, is harder than Scizor. Scizor is maybe about medium difficulty, where they say intermediate's about right. I think Scyther is probably closer to expert difficulty for a newer player. In general, I actually like newer players getting a Pokemon like this because you get 2 Pokemon in 1, so you kind of figure out what you want to play, right? But I would say this kind of veers to the harder side. I'd put it in our C tier right here. Not ideal for newer players. It's going to give you 2 different play styles. You're going to be playing 2 different Pokemon classes, essentially. Scizor is an all-rounder, but Scyther is clearly set up like a speedster, so I actually think it's a little tricky for newer players to pick up Scizor. I wouldn't recommend it from a learning the game perspective, but it is cool to get 2 Pokemon for the price of 1, sort of. Snorlax, it's listed as novice, but I don't know. I actually think Snorlax is one of the tougher tanks to be good with, especially if you're accidentally grabbing Flail, or even on purpose grabbing Flail, which I believe you can get fined for in many states. Snorlax is actually not a novice Pokemon, I think. I would highly recommend going with a defender like Slowbro over something like Snorlax. The nice thing about Snorlax is it doesn't have to evolve, and its early secure is killer. Outside of that, I actually think positioning and setting things up with Snorlax is amazing, but a lot harder than some other tanks. B tier, I think, is fair because its early game is so good. Dragonite is listed as novice, and this is one, before I do these tier lists, I kind of run through them all, and then I talk it out loud. I might change my mind as I'm doing it out loud, but usually I kind of have a good idea of where everything's falling. This was one of the hardest ones to place for me. Outrage is tough. Hyper Beam doesn't feel as tough, but also Dragonite is not the best at fighting sometimes. You have to be very good with fighting with it, and its range, it's a ranged Pokemon, but it's not massive range like Pikachu. It's a much smaller range. They reduced its attack range on Dragonite. I wasn't really sure where to put this, and I'm gonna settle on putting it actually in our C tier. I know that sounds crazy, but given that 2 of its builds are wildly different, and it has to fight at a closer range than you want it to, its Unite can't really do the same kind of craziness it used to. I actually think this is not as ideal for newer players as it used to be. Mew. Mew's difficulty is listed as novice, and that's wild. If I was a new player and I was playing Mew, I feel like I would be playing a totally different game in some ways. And while I think for someone who's played the game a lot, you could pick up Mew and do very well with it very fast, I disagree that this is a novice Pokemon. At best, this is C tier. It's almost into the D tier in some ways. For a newer player, I would stay away from Mew, I would say. I don't think it's going to be easy for you. However, once you learn the game and the mechanics of it, Mew actually won't be that daunting. At first, though, I think it could be kind of a scary Pokemon. Azumarill. Azumarill, I think, is awesome. It's probably A tier. It might even be S tier. It's a really solid Pokemon for new players. Evolves at level 4, like I said, which is a huge benefit. It is melee, and you kind of have to figure out how its critical hits work and things like that. You might have to learn how to stack on it, which can be a little tough. You don't have to, by the way. You could run other items. I would say because of a couple factors, it pops out of the S tier, but a really, really solid choice for new players. Novice difficulty in the game, and that's kind of close to right. I think they got it pretty close. Espeon, difficulty novice. I kind of disagree with this. It's a ranged special attacker. It's a mage. I think it's a harder mage to use than Pikachu. I think I would put this at best A tier, but it's probably closer to B tier for me. It's kind of a middle of the road Pokemon. It's really, really good, and the buffs that are coming for it are going to be unbelievable, but I actually don't think it's super easy for newer players. You get punished pretty hard before level 4, and if you're just not really good at setting up your shots and aiming much, you're just kind of, I don't know, you won't feel very useful. That being said, once you get the hang of this, I think Espeon's pretty amazing. Mamoswine. Mamo is going to be, I think I put it S tier when I was first arranging this list, and you know what? I'm gonna put it A. And there's a reason for that, and it's because it's a 3-stage evolution. But besides that, I think Mamoswine is awesome. It's great. It's great early. It's pretty easy to do well with Mamo, and as you start to progress through the game, you'll just get better and better with it. Its difficulty's intermediate. The only thing I would say that makes it intermediate is you have to evolve twice. Besides that, I think this Pokemon is actually pretty beginner friendly. I really do, and Mamo's awesome right now. Tyranitar. Its difficulty's intermediate. I totally disagree. I think this is a very advanced Pokemon. I think the thing that's advanced about Tyranitar is you need to learn good macro with this Pokemon. You need to learn how to go around the map, how to farm, how to get your levels, how to make sure that you can fight effectively. Yes, it's a monster when it's fighting, and it's so freaking good, but I don't think it's an intermediate Pokemon. I think this is a pretty advanced Pokemon to do well with. I really do. I don't think T-Tar is easy for new players. However, if you happen to be playing against someone who didn't understand the game at all, let's say you're both kind of button mashing, there could be situations where it feels like this is completely broken. And there are times where Tyranitar is completely broken. Gardevoir, listed as intermediate, that's about right. It kind of hangs right out there with Espeon for me. Yeah, you play it at range, you gotta stay far away from enemies, you know, you need to set up good moments. It doesn't have a lot of mobility, but it's not the hardest thing to figure out. Its leveling changes were really, really nice for it, so I think that's a pretty fair assessment. Gardevoir, range, special attacker, intermediate, that sounds about right. Right in line there in the middle. Sableye, okay. Difficulty intermediate. I totally, look, maybe the difficulty's intermediate, I don't know what to tell you, but if you first pick up Sableye as the first Pokemon, as one of the first things, your introduction to Unite, you are gonna, it's just gonna be chaos. It's already chaos. Sableye is chaos, but no, this is not a good Pokemon for new players at all. It's crazy. You're invisible. I think you will pick up so many bad habits learning to play through Sableye. Just no. Not for newer players. Absol. Also, speedsters in general are tough. It's listed as an expert level Pokemon, and I happen to agree. To be good with Absol, I think you need a lot of experience in the game. I would recommend not starting with a Pokemon like Absol, even though it's very cool. It's just hard. It's kind of hard to win with. Garchomp, intermediate. I think that's about right, and I think it's actually a little higher than a B tier for me. I think it's closer to the C tier. It's deceptively tough. The thing is, it seems easy because all you got to do is walk next to an enemy Pokemon and press the A button, and you're like, and you're beating them up. But actually, you need to have very, very good positioning with Garchomp to excel with Garchomp. So I do not think this Pokemon is as easy as it would seem. It's melee, all-rounder, listed as intermediate. That's about right, but I think it's on the tougher side of intermediate. Lucario. So this is a weird one. It's listed as expert. And I think Extreme Speed Lucario is one of the most difficult builds to play, but I think Power Up Punch is actually It's hard, but it's not even close to as hard. At least that was my experience with Lucario. I'm actually putting this in the C tier, not the D tier. I think it's, look, everything in the C and D tier is a little tougher for new players, but I actually think you'll have an easier time with Lucario than you would with something like Gengar. Again, the extreme speed build is probably pretty different here. In general, it's listed as expert, so the skill ceiling, the ability to be good with Lucario is, you know, up in the rafters. This Pokemon is amazing. But I do think it's not as hard as some of the others we've looked at. Glaceon is listed as intermediate. I disagree. I think Glaceon's either A, maybe even almost S. It's probably the, I mean, a lot of the EVs have some easy stuff to use. I think this is easier to sort of set up than a Pokemon like Espeon. Maybe the Icicle Shards could be a little confusing, and that's why I'm leaving it outside of our S tier right here. But I think it's a really solid choice for new players, and it's easy to do well with, which I think is great. Let's see, Crustle, difficulty novice. This was a hard one for me. I think Crustle is closer to B tier. It's almost C tier. And it's because for whatever reason, Crustle is one of the hardest Pokemon for people to play effectively. I love Crustle. I recently played it in a tournament. I think it's a very valid and solid Pokemon. Solid as a rock, as solid as a cake. But at the same time, I do think for whatever reason, things inside of Crustle's kit convince players to play in a bizarre way. So I'm going to put it B tier for that reason. Zoroark is a very tough Pokemon, one of the hardest in the game. Expert is exactly right. Horrible for new players. You're not going to get anything done with this Pokemon if you're new. It's so tough. It's a really, really tough one. Delphox is listed as novice, and I don't know if that's actually true, but I think it is easier than maybe a more complex Mage like a Mew or something like that. I would say it's pretty solid for newer players, but you are going to run into some issues farming with this Pokemon and getting your levels. For that reason, I'm going to put it A. But that's a low A, in my opinion. These aren't exactly ordered over here, but that's a low A. I think it is good for newer players because if you're running Fire Spin or Mystical Fire, you just get to spam abilities a lot at incredible range. But I don't know, even still, I don't think it's soups easy. It's not the easiest Pokemon in the game. Greninja is expert, and I agree with that. Very bad for new players. They give it to you for free. I kind of wish they wouldn't, only because it can be really, really tough to play, and you'll often find your team's Greninja to be either fantastic or really, really detrimental for the squad. Mostly because Greninja is freaking cool as heck. Everyone wants to play it, and it's really hard to win with. Talon. This blows my mind. It's listed as novice, and it couldn't be further from the truth. Talon is one of the toughest Pokemon in the game to do well with. I mean, maybe they think the mechanics of it feel basic. I don't know. I think Talon is actually extremely, extremely difficult to do well with. Its win rate reflects that. It's such a hard Pokemon to do well with. So I totally disagree that it's a novice choice. It's definitely not, in my opinion. Aegislash, another Pokemon that is right up there with the hardest in the game to play. Aegislash is one of the toughest Pokemon to learn. The flow and the combos of Aegislash, once you get the hang of this Pokemon, it is incredible, but I think it's one of the toughest to learn. The game lists it as expert, and I happen to agree with them. It is an expert level Pokemon. Sylveon is listed as intermediate, but I actually think it's closer to Glaceon here. I think it's a really solid early beginner Pokemon. It's easy. Both of its movesets are pretty basic. Hyper Voice and Mystical Fire, they're kind of easy to target onto enemies and do decently well with. I don't think it's as easy as something like a Pikachu because Pikachu's range is insane. But in general, I actually think it's pretty good. A solid one for new players. Probably easier than intermediate, I would say. Trevenant's a weird one. I actually think Trevenant is a harder tank than a lot of the tanks that you see here. Its moves are weird. You lose health by using its moves, and you really need to understand that flow. Pain Split is the craziest move. I don't know what's going on there. I talk about it too much. But I don't think this is a super easy Pokemon. I'm putting it in my C tier. I would not recommend a new player grab this one. Hoopa's also a weird one. It's listed as expert, and I think that's right. And I also think that's wrong. And part of me is thinking, well, to be really good with this Pokemon and to be useful, like really useful, it's extremely tough. But it's at extreme, it has like crazy good range, and it does decent damage and can bring your team in with the Unite move. However, it is complex. I don't think it's D tier complex, but I will put it into the C tier right here. It might even be closer to B, honestly. It's not the hardest thing in the game to kind of pick up. I think Expert might be a little much, but some of the strategies that you can make happen with it are incredible, so maybe they're kind of like focusing in on that. Decidueye, listed as intermediate. I think that's relatively true. However, I think because this Pokemon is so punishable, sadly, I'm putting it in the Decidueye Memorial tier. When you're good with Decidueye, life is amazing. If you're not good with Decidueye, you're one of the biggest liabilities on your team. Its Unite move is somehow, when you're playing Decidueye, it makes you Unite Rayquaza. I don't know why. It's not a good strategy. I wish people would stop doing it. You legally have to Unite move Rayquaza. And for that reason, I have to put it down in the Decidueye Memorial tier. Zarina. Zarina is listed as Expert, and I think that's close. I actually think Zarina's maybe closer to the C tier right here. This could be wrong. To be insane with Zarina, I think it has one of the highest skill ceiling. Like, people can pop off with this Pokemon like no other, but I actually don't think it's the toughest thing in the game to be good with. It kind of reminds me of Lucario, where you can see players play this at insanely high levels, but I don't think it's as hard as something like, I don't know, Zoroark to be good with. I really don't, but it's extremely good. Comfey, listed as novice, and now here's the interesting thing that happens with this Pokemon, is I don't exactly know where to put this, because if you literally don't know how to play the game and you're just tapping buttons, you do nothing. If you have a very small knowledge of the game, I guess that's a nice sweet spot for it, but you're not very impactful and you don't learn that much about the game. So I actually think this is maybe A tier, but that's almost, it might even be closer to B tier, honestly. You're just gonna have moments where your Comfey is, no, I'm putting it B tier. You're gonna have moments where your Comfey is alone, doing nothing, or you're just gonna be sitting on an ally getting very little value. I feel like you actually won't learn that much about Pokemon Unite from Comfey. Its difficulty kind of is novice. That's kind of true, but it's also, to play it at that level is like playing nothing at all almost. I don't know. It's a hard one. That's a really hard one to put on the list. Buzzwole, difficulty intermediate. I totally disagree. Buzzwole is extremely difficult. It might feel kind of intermediate, but no. To actually do this Pokemon justice, I think you need to understand what's going on with it. And it doesn't win that well. It has kind of a lower win rate because I think this Pokemon is tough to find all the value you want out of it. I actually think it's more of an expert level Pokemon. Now on to Zeraora, which is without question in my Decidueye Memorial tier right here. No question about it, Zeraora is a very, very tough Pokemon. No. This is a really hard one for newer players. They give it for free, and it's so freaking cool, which is why I think people pick it up. But this is not an easy Pokemon to do well with, and I would highly recommend not playing a lot of it as a newer player. Cinderace is listed as novice, and it's a ranged attacker. It's actually not too bad. I think it's better than something like Greninja by a lot. I don't know if it's sort of that easy, but actually you need to have great positioning with this Pokemon. The easy thing about it is its kit feels very understandable. You have a dash, and you have either a big fireball that you kick, or you bounce around with Blaze Kick. I'm gonna put it A tier, but again, this is another one that's a low A tier for me. It's closer to B at times. It's not crazy hard, but it's also not crazy easy. Greedent, one of the hardest Pokemon in the game. It's weird because it doesn't seem like it, but Greedent is really, really tough, especially the Covet Belch build, which is, you know, pretty much. There are other times you could use the other build. Both have a lot of value, but Covet Belch is really great and really, really hard to get a handle of. So I think this is, strangely enough, one of the tougher Pokemon in the game. The game lists it as expert, and I think that's actually right. Eldegoss. The Eldegoss. Eldegoss is really good. Oops. Eldegoss is really good. Really, really good. Great for new players. You play at range. It's one of the first Pokemon they can give you when you first start the game. You get to pick one of the licenses. It's an awesome early support. I love this for new players. Absolutely. Eldegoss is an S tier for me, for sure. Cramorant is listed as expert, and that's about right. I'm going to put it C. Dive might be closer. Dive is in the Decidueye Memorial tier. Surf Hurricane's closer to B, C, but it's not super good. I actually think Cram, it listed as expert, and that's pretty close. It's pretty close. It's not one of the first Pokemon I would have someone hop on. If someone was looking at my list and they said, I see Zarina and Cram there in C tier, I could put them both in D tier. I wouldn't argue too much with you. They're tough Pokemon. Duraludon, listed as intermediate. I think it's right there with Cinderace. I actually don't think it's that tough. The difficult thing about Duraludon is that you don't have great repositioning with it. Dragon Tail's harder to use than something like Flame Charge. But at the same time, you attack at extreme range. Maybe because of Flash Cannon, this feels like it's a little more intermediate. But I think Duraludon is actually a pretty solid Pokemon for new players. I don't know why the way I said that in my brain, I was like, I think Duraludon, like, it pinged my brain. I think Duraludon is actually pretty solid for newer players. It's not that tough, and you kind of understand the mechanics of securing things, securing KOs, securing objectives and things like that. So I think it would actually not be too bad for newer players. Dragapult is listed as expert. That feels a little much, honestly. I don't think it's that tough. I think it's maybe closer to the B tier, honestly. Maybe C, but it doesn't... I don't think it's that stressful of a Pokemon to be good with. Look, like a lot of these ranged attackers, you're gonna need to learn positioning, which is what's keeping them out of being a super easy choice. Yes, they're A-pressers, but you do need to be able to figure out where to position yourself in a fight. I guess the thing that maybe puts it into expert from the game's perspective is Dragon Dance, because you've got to kind of learn, you know what? I think I'm actually going to agree with the game a little bit more here. Because of Dragon Dance, I'm going to put it down in my C tier. I am. Yeah, I was going to keep it up in the B tier, but I actually do think Dragon Dance, it's going to set up some situations that are a little tough for newer players. So, okay. All right, game. I'll give it to you. That's a little, that is a little tougher right here. Just adjusting my tier list slightly. As we talk about Urshifu, our final Pokemon on the list, listed as intermediate. I think that's actually about right. I think B tier is a very solid place for this Pokemon. I don't think it's that tough to learn either of its move sets. However, I think both of them are freaking unbelievably good right now. I do think Urshifu is a pretty middle of the road Pokemon to learn. It's probably an easier Lucario. You know, actually, this is great. It's an easier Lucario and an easier Zarina. That's what it feels like. And it's also kind of better than both in some ways right now. So Urshifu, I think, is a very, intermediate is a great place for it. The B tier is a fantastic place. And finally, I will name one Pokemon, my God tier Pokemon of this tier list. I'm not sure if you could guess who it is, but it's actually the Pokemon that I ended up playing a ton when I first picked up the game. And I thought it was a really great way to learn mechanics of this game and to learn how to work with a team. My God tier Pokemon for new players is actually Eldegoss. You play this Pokemon at range, and while you're doing that, you're healing your team, you're giving them shields, your Unite move pushes enemies away, and it also heals your squad. It has decent secure, it has decent damage. Eldegoss is all around freaking amazing, and I think it's great for new players. So there you go. There is our tier list right here, and because some new players might pick this up, I don't think I'm going to switch things up at the end. That's right. If you don't know, now you know. Don't skip to the end of a tier list because you see me start moving things around. I go like this and I start saying, that's why Sableye is without question the easiest Pokemon for new players. Thank you all for watching. Thank you for listening. I hope you enjoyed this. I'd really love to hear your feedback in the comments. I'll see y'all next time.